He threw the divorce papers at her feet like she was staff he was dismissing. Not across a desk, not slid quietly across a table. He threw them, let the pages scatter across the marble floor of their bedroom, while their daughter's drawing hung on the wall 3 feet away, and their son's baseball trophy sat on the shelf, collecting dust he never noticed. And then Baek Do-hwan folded his arms and waited for Zuri to beg. She didn't pick the papers up right away. She looked at them on the floor. Then she looked at him. And then she walked to his desk, picked up a pen, knelt down, gathered every scattered page in order, carried them to the dining table, sat down and signed her name on every line that required it. Do-hwan watched her do it and felt something shift in the room that he couldn't name and didn't understand and wouldn't stop thinking about for the next 3 years of his life. If you've ever watched someone walk away from you and realized only after they were already gone that you were the one who drove them out the door, then you already understand what this story is about. If you've ever convinced yourself that providing for your family was the same thing as being present for them, this story is going to be uncomfortable. It should be. Stay with it all the way through. What Zuri leaves behind on that desk is not just a letter. It is everything Do-hwan thought he controlled, laid out in her handwriting, quiet and devastating and impossible to ignore. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button if this already has your attention. And drop a comment, tell us what city or country you're watching from. These stories have traveled further than we ever expected, and we want to know how far they've gone. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Zuri Adebayo turned 35, she woke up alone. That wasn't unusual. Do-hwan had stopped sleeping regular hours somewhere around year 4 of their marriage when the import logistics business expanded into 3 Pacific ports, and his phone began ringing before sunrise. By year 8, Zuri had stopped reaching across the bed when she woke. She already knew what her hand would find. She lay there for a few minutes, listening to the house. Malik was 17 now and slept like the dead until 10 on weekends. Ariel was 13 and had inherited Zuri's habit of waking early and lying still, thinking, before the day started. Zuri could sometimes hear her daughter moving around down the hall, quiet as a shadow, just existing in the early morning the way Zuri herself had always done. It was the thing she loved most about Ariel that she had never been able to say out loud without feeling like she was revealing too much of herself. She got up, put on coffee, and stood at the kitchen window watching the backyard. The garden had gone slightly wild at the edges because the landscaping crew Do-hwan hired came on Tuesdays when Zuri was at work and never quite finished what they started. There was a bed of irises along the far fence that had been trying to take over for 2 summers. She kept meaning to deal with it. She was 35 years old, standing in a kitchen worth more than her parents' house, and she was thinking about irises. That was the morning, she admitted to herself, not for the first time, but for the first time clearly that she had been disappearing inside this life for years, and the disappearing had started. So gradually, she hadn't noticed until most of her was already gone. She heard Do-hwan's car in the driveway at 7:42. She knew the sound of that engine the way she knew her children's breathing. He came in through the side entrance the way he always did, set his keys on the hook and walked into the kitchen without calling out her name. When he saw her standing at the window, he stopped. "You're up early," he said. "It's my birthday," she said. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, more like recalculation. The expression of a man who has been presented with a logistical problem and is already sorting through his options. "I know," he said. She turned back to the window. He came to stand beside her and put his hand on her shoulder. His hand was warm, and she had spent 11 years loving his hands, the way they moved, when he was making a point, the way they rested on her back in public, the way they had held both of their children within minutes of their births. She still loved his hands. That was one of the things she hadn't expected. That love and exhaustion could live in the same body at the same time, without either one canceling the other out. "I'll make a reservation tonight," he said. "Somewhere you like." "You don't have to." "Zuri, I'm serious. Don't move things around on my account. It never works out anyway." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to address that or let it go. He let it go, which was what he always did, which was part of the reason she was standing at a kitchen window on her birthday, thinking about overgrown irises, instead of feeling anything close to celebration. He left 2 hours later without them making a reservation. That evening she ordered pizza and ate it on the couch with Malik and Ariel while they watched a movie Ariel picked. It was fine. It was actually fine. Malik fell asleep against her shoulder before the credits, and she sat there in the dark with her son heavy on one side and her daughter quiet on the other, and she thought, this is enough. This can be enough. But she was lying to herself, and she knew it, and the knowing had grown a shape inside her chest. She couldn't breathe around anymore. Do-hwan had not always been this way. That was the detail that made it so much harder, and Zuri had never been able to make people understand this. Her closest friend, a woman named Carla who had watched the marriage from the outside for a decade, always said it simply, leave. Just leave. Carla made it sound like a door you walked through once you'd located it. But Zuri remembered who Do-hwan was at 30. She had been 23 when they met, working as an office manager for a mid-sized architecture firm, and Do-hwan had come in to discuss a commercial renovation on the south side of the city. He wasn't the loudest person in the room. He was the most deliberate. He listened to people when they talked in a way that made you feel like every word you said had value. He took her to dinner 4 times before he kissed her. She thought at the time that it was respect. Looking back, she understood. It was also calculation. But at 23, she hadn't learned yet that those two things weren't mutually exclusive. She fell in love with his discipline, his quiet intensity, the way he made decisions without drama, the way he said her name Zuri like the word itself meant something to him. He told her about the import business during their 3rd month together. He told her it was complicated. He told her there were things on the margins he wasn't proud of, inherited arrangements he was working to separate himself from. She believed him, partly because she wanted to, and partly because he seemed genuinely troubled by it. He talked about his obligations, with the weight of a man who understood he was carrying something he hadn't chosen. By the time she understood the full architecture of what he was involved in, she was 24 and pregnant with Malik, and already so deeply inside the life that leaving felt like cutting off her own hand. She didn't leave. She told herself it was because she loved him. She told herself it was because she believed he would change. Both of those things were partially true, but the larger truth, the one she carried alone for 11 years, was that she was afraid. Not of Do-hwan himself. He had never raised a hand to her. His violence lived in other rooms of his world, rooms she was never invited into, rooms she pretended didn't exist. She was afraid of the edges of his world, the way certain men looked at her when she attended events with him, the way conversation stopped when she entered spaces she wasn't supposed to be in, the way she understood, without anyone having to say it directly, that Do-hwan's protection was the only reason she moved through his world without harm. And protection like that has a cost. It costs you the ability to imagine leaving. She told herself the children needed stability. She told herself that a broken home would damage them. She told herself she would wait until they were older. She was still waiting at 35, standing at a kitchen window on her birthday, while her husband drove away without making a dinner reservation. The decision didn't come like a lightning strike. It came the way most irrevocable things come slowly, then all at once. It was a Tuesday 3 weeks after her birthday. Ariel had a school performance. A choral concert, one of those things that parents shuffle into an auditorium for and sit through with their phones in their laps, and it matters deeply to the child on the stage and not very much to anyone else in the room. Except it mattered to Zuri. It mattered to her in the way that Ariel's things always mattered to her, because she saw herself in her daughter, the quietness, the observing, the way Ariel performed with her chin slightly up, not showing off but simply deciding to be heard. Do-hwan had said he would be there. She sat in the 4th row with an empty seat beside her and watched her daughter's eyes find her from the stage and then move to the empty seat and then come back to her mother's face. Ariel's expression didn't change. She kept singing. Her voice was clear and she didn't miss a note. She had learned somewhere in her 13 years to perform through disappointment without letting it show. She had learned it from watching Zuri. That was when Zuri understood. Not that Do-hwan was a bad man. She had complicated feelings about that question. She wasn't sure she'd ever fully answer. but that she was teaching her daughter that this was what love looked like. That love looked like an empty seat beside you, and a face you kept neutral because you'd learned the hard way not to let anyone see you expecting more. She was not going to do that to Ariel. She came home that night and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours after the children went to bed, and she made herself think clearly about everything she'd spent 11 years not letting herself think clearly about. She was not powerless. She had a degree. She had 11 years of experience, managing the household finances experience. Do-hwan had given her more autonomy than he probably realized, because he trusted her, and because it was beneath his attention, and because he assumed she would always be there to manage it. She had savings he didn't know about, because Zuri had been quietly, carefully building a separate account for 4 years. Not from paranoia, from a feeling she hadn't let herself name. She called a lawyer the next morning from her car, parked down the block from the house. It took 6 weeks to prepare everything properly. She was methodical about it. She made no dramatic moves, started no arguments, changed nothing about her daily behavior. She told no one except Carla and the lawyer. She went about her life, and she prepared, and she waited for the right moment. The right moment arrived because Do-hwan created it. She hadn't planned to confront him. That wasn't the word for it anyway. But 6 weeks after she filed quietly with the court, Do-hwan came home from a meeting that had clearly gone badly. She could read him after 11 years the way you read weather, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her with the clipped certainty of a man announcing a board decision that they needed to talk about the future of this marriage. He said he had been patient. He said she had become distant. He said he felt like she wasn't present in this relationship anymore. She sat very still and let him talk. He said he was willing to work on things. He said he thought they needed to recommit. He said, and this was the sentence that nearly cracked something, he said he was trying to give her the life she deserved. When he was finished, she said, "The papers are already filed." He stared at her. She slid the copy of the filing across the table. "I've had a lawyer for 6 weeks," she said. "Everything is already in order." He stood up. He was not a man who yelled, but the silence that came off him in that moment was its own kind of noise. He picked up the papers. He looked at them for a long time. Then he set them down, walked to the window, stood with his back to her for several minutes. When he turned around, his face had settled into something controlled and very cold. "You did this without telling me." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about that. About all the ways she had tried to tell him for 11 years that didn't count as telling him, because he hadn't listened. "Because you were going to talk me out of it," she said. "And I knew if I let you talk long enough, I would let you." Again, he didn't respond to that. What he did instead, and she would think about this afterward for a long time, trying to decide what it revealed about him, was pick up the papers from the table and throw them. Not at her. He threw them across the room, let them scatter across the marble, and then stood there breathing. Zuri looked at the papers on the floor. Then she looked at him. Then she picked up a pen, gathered the pages, sat back down, and signed every line. She signed them cleanly, without hesitation, without visible emotion, and slid them back across the table toward him. Do-hwan watched her do all of this and said nothing. He said nothing for a very long time. She packed that same night. Not everything. She wasn't trying to strip the house. She took what was hers clothes, some books, the jewelry her mother had given her, the photographs she'd chosen carefully from the walls, the children's school records and medical files, and all the small documents of their lives that she had always been the one to track anyway. Malik helped her without asking questions. He was 17, and he had his father's quality of knowing when a moment called for action over words. He carried boxes to the car, and he didn't ask where they were going, and he didn't look back at the house until they were at the end of the driveway. Ariel sat in the back seat and held a stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 4 and stared out the window. Zuri drove them to a house she had rented 3 weeks earlier. Small in a decent neighborhood, close to both of their schools. She had furnished it simply. It was clean and it was quiet. And it was nothing like the mansion they'd just left. And when Ariel walked in and looked around, she said, "I like it." Malik made them all sandwiches, Later, after the children were in their rooms, Zuri sat at the kitchen table of her new small house and thought about the envelope she'd left on Do-hwan's desk. She had written the letter 2 weeks earlier, when she was still living in the mansion and moving through the final preparations. She had written it because she realized she had things to say that she would never be able to say to his face, not because she was afraid of him, but because face to face he would respond, argue, explain, and she needed him to simply receive what she had to say without interruption. The letter was not a weapon. She hadn't written it to destroy him. She wrote it because she needed him to finally understand not what she felt, not what she had lost, but what the marriage had been. Not the marriage as he had experienced it from the outside, managing it the way he managed everything, from a position of control and distance, but the marriage as it had actually been, the inside of it. The 11-year interior of a life lived alongside a man who was present in every material way and absent in every way that counted. She left it on his desk in a sealed envelope. Across the front, she wrote 5 words in her clearest handwriting. "Read this after I'm gone." She drove away and she didn't look in the rearview mirror. Do-hwan walked through the house for 3 nights before he opened the envelope. Not because he didn't want to know what it said. He told himself that was the reason. He told himself he wasn't ready to engage with her accusations, her grievances, whatever calculated damage she'd packaged into that letter. But that was a lie he didn't quite believe, even while he was thinking it. The truth was that as long as the envelope sat sealed on his desk, he could still believe he understood what was in it. He knew Zuri. He had spent 11 years believing he understood her completely, the way he understood everything that fell within his orbit. He was a man who read people the way other men read financial reports, quickly, accurately, with confidence in his conclusions. But Zuri had filed divorce papers without telling him for 6 weeks, and he hadn't seen it coming. That fact had been sitting in his chest since the night she left, an unfamiliar weight he didn't have a category for. He was not a man who got surprised. He did not operate in a world where surprises were survivable. He had built his entire professional life around anticipating what other people would do before they did it. His wife of 11 years had outmaneuvered him, quietly, patiently, with a lawyer, and a separate bank account, and a rented house, and he had not seen any of it. He sat in the empty mansion and tried to understand where he had missed it, and he kept coming back to the same answer. He had stopped watching because he had assumed she would always be there. He had treated her permanence like a fact of his life, rather than something she was choosing. She had stopped choosing it, and he hadn't noticed. He opened the letter on the 4th night. He sat at his desk in the room where he had run his empire for a decade, and he read her handwriting, slow and deliberate as she was, and he did not move for a very long time after he reached the end. She didn't accuse him of anything he didn't already know he'd done. That was the first thing that cut through him. He had prepared himself for anger, for the accounting of grievances he deserved, for the list of failures he would have to defend himself against, or absorb. He had his responses ready. But Zuri hadn't written accusations. She had written the truth, and the truth was quieter and more precise and harder to defend against than any accusation she could have made. She wrote about Ariel's concert. She wrote the date and the seat number. She wrote that Ariel had searched the auditorium from the stage, that her eyes had stopped at the empty seat, and that she had sung every note perfectly anyway. She learned how to keep going when you don't show up, Zuri wrote. She learned that from me, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I taught her that an absent person is something you perform through. Do-hwan read that paragraph 4 times. He sat in his office in his empty house, and he read it until the words stopped being words and became something else, something that had been waiting 11 years for the moment it could finally reach him. And somewhere in the 3rd hour of sitting with that letter, he reached the section at the end that he hadn't expected. The section that didn't grieve, didn't accuse, didn't explain. The section that simply told him what she had done. She had told Malik the truth. Their son, 17 years old, now knew who his father actually was. Do-hwan put the letter down on the desk. He sat very still for a long time. Outside the window, Seattle went about its night. The city didn't know. Nobody knew. The man who had spent 20 years making sure that certain truths about him stayed in certain rooms, had just read, in his wife's careful handwriting, that his 17-year-old son had been given a key to all the rooms. He picked the letter up and read it again from the beginning. And then he did something he hadn't done in more years than he could account for. He sat in the silence of the life he'd built, and he let it be silent, and he didn't reach for his phone or call anyone or move to fix anything. He just sat there, with the weight of it. Do-hwan didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk until the city outside went from dark to that particular shade of gray that comes before sunrise, not light, just the absence of full dark, and he read Zuri's letter 2 more times. Not because he'd missed anything. He hadn't missed anything. He read it because some part of him was still searching for the version of it that would hurt less, and that version didn't exist. By 6 in the morning, he had made coffee he didn't drink, walked through 7 rooms of a house that felt like a museum of decisions he couldn't take back, and stood at the window of the bedroom where Zuri had slept beside him for 11 years, looking at the garden she'd planted in the first year of their marriage and neglected in every year after, because she'd run out of time or will or both. The irises along the back fence had taken over exactly the way she'd said they would. He hadn't known she'd said that. He hadn't been there for that conversation. He hadn't been there for most conversations. His phone had 17 unread messages from the previous evening. 2 from his operations manager, a Korean-American man named Jin-soo, who had been with him since the beginning, and who communicated everything with the same flat efficiency, whether he was reporting a successful shipment or a serious problem. 4 from a port liaison in Tacoma. 3 from his personal attorney, which meant something legal had moved without his authorization, or something legal was about to. The rest were from men whose names didn't need explaining in the context of what Do-hwan's business actually was at its core. He put the phone face down on the desk. He picked up the letter instead. He read the line about Malik again. She had written it simply. No drama, no underlining, no attempt to maximize the impact. That was Zuri's way she delivered devastating things, the same way she delivered ordinary things, in a clear voice with her chin level, and the devastation arrived on its own, without any help from her. Malik knows, she had written. I told him 3 days before I filed. I told him because he is 17 and he was starting to ask questions I couldn't answer honestly without telling him the truth, and I refused to lie to him the way I had been lying to him and to myself for 11 years. He deserved the truth more than either of us, deserved the comfort of him not knowing it. Do-hwan folded the letter with great care. The way you handle something that has already caused damage and might cause more, and placed it back in the envelope. He showered, dressed, and drove to Zuri's new house before 8 in the morning. He didn't call first. The house was smaller than he'd expected. That was the first thing that registered, not accusation, just the plain fact of it. A narrow front porch, a yard that needed work, curtains in the front windows that weren't her style, which meant she'd bought them quickly. She had moved fast, 6 weeks of preparation, and she had moved his children into a house with curtains she wouldn't have chosen. He sat in the car for a few minutes. He wasn't sure what he intended to accomplish. He had driven here on something that wasn't quite impulse and wasn't quite plan, and now that he was here, the absence of a clear objective felt like a problem he should have anticipated. He got out of the car. Zuri came out of the front door before he reached the porch steps. She had apparently seen the car. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, and her hair was natural, pulled back, no jewelry. She looked like herself, not the version of herself that attended his events and shook hands with his associates and performed the particular role of Do-hwan's wife. The version of herself that had existed before he got hold of her. She stopped at the top of the porch steps. I read the letter, he said. I know. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. 3 concrete steps between them. He had the feeling that the distance was deliberate, and that, closing it without permission, would be a mistake. You told Malik? Yes, without telling me first. She looked at him steadily. Her face was doing the thing it did. The thing he had once read as patience and now understood was something else entirely. It was the look of a woman who had already had this argument inside her own head, who had anticipated every version of it, who had made peace with her position before she ever had to defend it. Do-hwan, When was I supposed to tell you? In between which two things you were unavailable for? He didn't answer that. He's my son too. He is, and he's been watching you for 17 years. He's not stupid. He was already putting things together, the men who came to the house, the conversations that stopped when he walked in, the way certain people talk to you, versus how everyone else in the world talks to people. He asked me last year whether you were safe. She paused. He asked me if we were safe. Something moved through Do-hwan's chest at that. Not pain, exactly. Something colder. And you told him. I told him the truth, which is that his father is a powerful and complicated man who has made choices that I cannot protect him from knowing about forever. And that whatever his father is, he loves his children. She stopped. I told him that part too. I want you to know I said that. Do-hwan Tuchin stood at the bottom of the steps and felt the ground under him, doing something it had never done before in his adult life. He was not a man who experienced vertigo. He was not a man who was affected by the movement of things he couldn't control. But right now, on a Tuesday morning, on a narrow porch, in a neighborhood he'd never been to, before his wife moved here, he felt genuinely unsure of what came next. Not tactically. He knew what came next tactically. But underneath the tactics, in the place where he kept the things he didn't examine, something was shifting. I want to talk to him, Do-hwan said. That's up to him. Not me. He's 17. He's old enough to decide whether he wants to speak to you. I'm not going to force him into a room with you because you're ready. He'll talk to you when he's ready. She crossed her arms. Not defensively. More like a person settling in. That's going to have to be something you accept. Do-hwan looked at her for a long moment. You planned all of this, he said. Not an accusation, an observation, everything. The lawyer, the account, this house. All of it, yes. How long? Seriously. She let out a short breath. How long have I been planning to leave? Or how long have I known this marriage was over? He didn't answer. Those are two different questions with two different answers, and I think you already know what both of them are. He did know. He just hadn't been able to make himself acknowledge it until she said it out loud, in that voice on that porch, in her gray sweater with the curtain she hadn't chosen behind her. Ariel's concert, he said. Something changed in Zuri's face. Just slightly. The steadiness cracked a fraction of an inch. Don't, she said. I should have been there. Don't do this here. Do-hwan? Not on my porch at 8 in the morning with my daughter, inside that house. I'm not doing anything. I'm telling you. You're doing what you always do when you've read the room and realized you've lost ground. You're making a gesture. Her voice was still level, but something had sharpened inside it. You drove over here without calling. You're standing at the bottom of my steps. You're telling me you read the letter and you should have been at the concert. That's not a conversation. That's a performance. That's not fair. Do-hwan. She said his name once, flat and final, like a door closing. I spent 11 years being fair to you. I gave you fair. I gave you more than fair. You don't get to use that word with me right now. He stood there. He knew she was right. He knew it with the same certainty. He knew market conditions and risk assessments, and the character of men who worked for him. He was standing here because the letter had shaken him and he had driven over without a plan, because he was not accustomed to feeling shaken, and he had needed to be in the same physical space as the source of it. That was not a strategy. That was a feeling. He was operating from a feeling. It was so unfamiliar, he almost didn't recognize it for what it was. I'll wait, he said finally. For Malik. Tell him I'll wait. Zuri studied him for a moment. I'll tell him you came, she said. The rest is his to decide. He waited 12 days. In those 12 days, Do-hwan ran his businesses with the same surface competence he always had. He attended meetings, made decisions, signed documents, sat in rooms with men who needed to see that everything was functioning normally. He was good at functioning normally under pressure. He had been doing it since he was 22 years old, and his father had handed him something he hadn't asked for and told him to grow into it. But inside those 12 days, underneath the performance of normalcy, things were moving that he couldn't stop. Jin-soo caught it first. He always caught things first. Jin-soo was 53 years old. and had worked for Do-hwan's family for longer than Do-hwan himself, and he had the particular quality of a man who has survived multiple regimes by being the most observant person in every room he entered. They were in the back office of the import warehouse in Tacoma on the 6th day after Do-hwan's visit to Zuri's porch. When Jin-soo set down a shipping manifest and said, without looking up, "You're distracted." "I'm fine. You approved the wrong routing on the Incheon shipment. I caught it before it processed." Jin-soo looked up now. His face was weathered and specific, the face of a man who had seen enough that very little registered anymore. "That's not a mistake you make." Do-hwan was quiet for a moment. "Fix the routing, already done." Jin-soo folded his hands on the desk. "The men are talking. They always talk. They're saying the divorce has affected you. They're saying Zuri took something with her when she left." He paused. "Some of them think she took leverage." Do-hwan looked at him. "Leverage. Information about operations. About structure. About certain arrangements." Jin-soo kept his voice entirely neutral. "I'm not saying I believe it. I'm telling you what's being said." The air in the room changed. Do-hwan had spent 20 years building an organization where certain things were understood without being spoken. The hierarchy of consequence. The cost of disloyalty. The understanding that certain problems were handled rather than discussed. He had also spent 20 years keeping his family, specifically Zuri, and the children, completely separated from any part of that world that might make them a liability or a target. The men talking about Zuri as a source of leverage meant that separation was already being questioned. "Who is saying this?" Do-hwan said. His voice had dropped. Not loud, never loud, but the room got smaller when he spoke like that. Different conversations, different rooms. Jin-soo was precise. But the same question keeps appearing. Whether she knows enough to be a problem. She doesn't know specifics. She was never involved. "I know that. You know that." Jin-soo tilted his head slightly. "But she was your wife for 11 years. She lived in your house. She heard conversations she may not have understood. She met people whose names she would recognize. She is not a problem." "I'm not saying she is. I'm saying other people are wondering. And wondering in our business sometimes becomes something else." Do-hwan stood up. He walked to the window that looked out over the warehouse floor, where legitimate employees moved legitimate cargo and had no idea what else moved through the same infrastructure. And he stood with his hands behind his back and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Fear, not for himself, for Zuri, for Malik and Ariel in their small house with the wrong curtains. "Make it clear," he said finally, to whoever is having these conversations, that Zuri is not a subject of discussion, that she is not an asset, not a liability, not a concern, that she exists completely outside this organization. He turned from the window. "And if I find out that any man in our operation has approached her, contacted her, or gone within 2 blocks of that house, the conversation I have with him will be the last conversation he has with anyone." Jin-soo nodded once. "Understood. Say it the way I said it." "I will." Do-hwan sat back down. He picked up the shipping manifest and looked at it without seeing it. "Who owns the Incheon timing issue?" he said. Jin-soo understood the conversation had closed. He opened his folder. "Logistics coordinator named Park." "New. I'll handle it." They returned to work. But Do-hwan spent the rest of that day with a cold, specific weight in his chest that had nothing to do with shipping manifests. Malik called on the 12th day, not Do-hwan's cell. The house line at the mansion. A number that still rang to the main hall, even though the house was now Do-hwan and his housekeeper and 4,000 square feet of rooms that nobody had a reason to enter. Do-hwan picked up before the second ring. "Dad." The word landed differently than it always had. Malik had called him Dad his entire life, and Do-hwan had never particularly examined the word. It was simply the word his son used, the designation, the shorthand for their relationship. But after 12 days of silence and 1 letter, and a conversation on a porch and 17 unread messages, the word arrived with weight. Malik, silence on the line. Do-hwan waited. He had learned very young that silence was a tool and patience was power, but this was his son, and those rules didn't apply the same way. And he was aware as he sat there that he was genuinely unsure how to do this. "Mom said you came by," Malik said. "I did. She said you wanted to talk. I did. I do. Another pause. Do-hwan heard something in the background, Ariel's voice, distant, then quiet. Malik had probably moved to another room. She told me everything, Malik said. His voice was 17 and steady, steadier than Do-hwan expected, and that steadiness landed harder than anything unsteady would have. It meant he'd had time to process. It meant he'd been sitting with it. I know she did, is it true? Not a question, the inflection was flat. It was a statement that required confirmation or denial and was not going to be deflected by careful wording. Do-hwan had been asked difficult questions by difficult people in difficult circumstances for 20 years. He had never answered one of them with unqualified honesty. Honesty in his world was a vulnerability you managed, not a value you practiced. His son was 17 and had a flat voice and was waiting for an answer. Yes, Do-hwan said. It's true. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had texture. All of it, Malik said, the business. The other part of it, yes. How long? Since before you were born. He paused. It was my father's before it was mine. Did Mom know when she married you? That was the question Do-hwan hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for, which meant it was the most honest question Malik could have asked. She knew there were things about my business that weren't clean, Do-hwan said carefully. She didn't know the full scope. Not in the beginning. But she found out over time. Yes, and she stayed. She stayed. Another long pause. Do-hwan sat in the silence of the mansion and held the phone and did not rush his son. I don't know what to do with this, Malik said finally. The steadiness slipped just slightly on that sentence. Just enough. I don't know if I'm supposed to be angry at you or what. Mom's not angry. She's just moved on. She's already making this new place home, and Ariel likes her school, and everyone's just moving. And I'm sitting here, and I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Do-hwan closed his eyes briefly. You're not supposed to feel any particular thing, he said. You're supposed to feel whatever you actually feel. That's not helpful, Dad. I know. I'm sorry. A beat. Are you going to change? Malik said. Like actually. Not tell me you're going to and then not. Actually. Do-hwan sat with that question. He was a man who made commitments in rooms where commitments had consequences, and he kept them because the consequences were real and immediate. He was not a man who made commitments to his family because the consequences there had turned out to be slow and delayed and had arrived all at once in the form of a letter on his desk. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say it with the certainty he used to close deals and settle disputes and make men trust him with their livelihoods. But he was talking to his son, and his son had already been lied to enough by omission and absence, and the particular dishonesty of a man who tells himself his family is provided for, when what he means is his family is managed. I'm going to try, Do-hwan said. That's the honest answer. I'm going to try, and it's going to be hard, and I might get things wrong. But I'm going to try. Malik was quiet. Okay, he said finally. That's okay. Can I see you a pause, then? Yeah. I think so. Yeah. They arranged to meet that Saturday at a coffee place Malik suggested near the new house, a place Do-hwan had never heard of. Neutral ground, his son's choice. Do-hwan hung up the phone and sat very still in the empty mansion. He told Jin-soo the following morning that he wanted to begin restructuring certain arrangements. Not everything at once. Carefully, systematically with legal cover and documentation that could withstand scrutiny. Jin-soo listened without expression. That's a significant undertaking, Jin-soo said. I know, it will be noticed. I know that too. Some men won't accept it quietly. That's their choice to make. Jin-soo folded his hands. Do-hwan, this is not something you walk away from in a matter of weeks. This infrastructure has taken 20 years to build. The relationships, the arrangements, the dependencies, these are not things you dissolve with a decision. I know how long it took to build it. Then you understand that unwinding it creates vulnerability. For you, for everyone connected to you. Jin-soo paused. Including people outside this organization. Do-hwan understood what he meant. Zuri, Malik, Ariel, which is exactly why it needs to be done carefully, Do-hwan said. Not announced, not dramatic, systematic. We identify which operations are exposed, which relationships are purely criminal, Which assets can be legitimized? We separate everything that can be separated, and the things that can't be separated. We'll deal with those when we reach them. Jinsu looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man who has followed another man for 30 years and is now trying to determine whether the direction has changed permanently or temporarily. Is this because of the divorce? Jinsu said. It's because I have a 17-year-old son who knows what I am, Do-hwan said, and a 13-year-old daughter who sang through a school concert with an empty seat beside her mother. And I am not going to spend whatever time I have left being exactly what both of them already know I am. Jinsu didn't respond to that. He picked up his folder. I'll begin a quiet audit of the most exposed operations, he said. It will take time. Take the time. Saturday arrived. The coffee place was small and busy, the kind of neighborhood spot that smelled like espresso and old wood, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and people with laptops who were clearly there for the entire afternoon. Do-hwan arrived 8 minutes early, which was unusual for him. He was always precisely on time, never early, because arriving early was a form of vulnerability he'd trained himself out of. He arrived early because this was his son, and he didn't want Malik to walk in and have to look around for him. Malik came in at exactly the time they'd agreed. He had Do-hwan's height and Zuri's eyes, and he moved through the room with a teenager's deliberate casualness that couldn't quite conceal the tension underneath it. He spotted Do-hwan, crossed to the table, sat down. They ordered coffee. They both ordered it black, which Do-hwan noticed and did not comment on. How's school? Do-hwan said. Malik looked at him. Dad, come on. Right. Do-hwan put down his cup. Right. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize for everything. I have a lot of things to apologize for. Yeah, but if you apologize for all of them at once, it's going to take like 6 hours, and I have somewhere to be at 3. Malik's mouth moved slightly. Almost a smile. I'm kidding. Sort of. Do-hwan sat back. For a moment in the particular light of that coffee shop, with his son sitting across from him, being 17 and complicated, and trying to figure out whether to be angry or forgiving or something else entirely, Do-hwan felt the full weight of every birthday he'd missed, every performance, every dinner that had gone cold, every time he'd chosen the empire over the table. He felt it not as guilt. Guilt was a feeling he could manage and set aside, but as loss. As the specific, irreversible loss of time that had existed and then stopped existing while he was somewhere else. I have something I need to tell you, Malik said. His voice had gone careful. Do-hwan waited. There's a man. He's been parked outside Mom's new house. Malik looked at him directly. Twice, same car. I noticed it because I notice things now. Since Mom told me, I notice everything. Do-hwan's chest went cold. Describe the car, he said. His voice was completely flat and completely controlled and had no resemblance to the voice he'd been using for the last 20 minutes. Malik described it. Make, color, partial plate number that he'd written down on his phone. Do-hwan looked at that partial plate number and cross-referenced it in his memory against people in his organization and came up with nothing certain but 2 possibilities, one of which was more concerning than the other. You did the right thing telling me, he said. Mom doesn't know. I didn't want to scare her. Don't tell her yet. Let me handle this. Malik looked at him, 17 years old, with Zuri's eyes seeing him clearly. Is this because of you? Is someone targeting us because of you? The honest answer was, possibly. The honest answer was that Jinsu had warned him. Men were already asking questions about Zuri, that the divorce had created a perception of vulnerability, that in the world Do-hwan operated in, vulnerability was an invitation. He had told Jinsu to make it clear. Apparently, someone hadn't received that message clearly enough. I don't know yet, Do-hwan said, but I'm going to find out. And then what? And then I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Malik stared at him. Dad, his voice was controlled, but underneath it something raw was surfacing. Mom left because she wanted to be safe. She wanted us to be safe. She left because your world was. He stopped, swallowed. And now you're telling me that she moved into a new house, and the first thing that happened is someone's already watching it? Do-hwan had no answer to that would help. I'm going to handle it, he said. That's not good enough, Malik. She left to get away from this. Malik's voice broke on the last word, just slightly, then steadied. She signed the papers and moved us into that house, and she's trying to build something that's just ours. That doesn't have your name on it, and someone is, already." He stopped again. Do-hwan sat across from his son in a coffee shop, with mismatched chairs, and he understood clearly and completely that there was no version of the next conversation that didn't require him to reckon with the fact that the danger he'd spent 20 years believing he'd quarantined had followed his family into a house he'd never been invited to, and that it had followed them there because of him. "I'm sorry," Do-hwan said. It came out differently than his earlier apologies. Not managed, not performed. Malik looked at him. "Fix it," his son said. Do-hwan left the coffee shop and sat in his car for 4 minutes before he made a single call. Not to Jin-soo, not to his attorney. He called a man named Cho, who had worked private security for Do-hwan's household for 6 years and who had been reassigned to the warehouse after Zuri moved, because Do-hwan had genuinely assumed that separation from his life meant separation from his problems. That assumption had just been disproven by his 17-year-old son, reading a partial plate number off his phone. Cho picked up on the second ring. "I need you at a residential address in Beacon Hill," Do-hwan said. "Tonight. Discreet. No presence visible from the street. You'll watch the house, and you'll report to me directly. Nobody else. Under duration? Until I tell you otherwise." He gave Cho the address and hung up. Then he sat in the car outside the coffee shop and looked at the partial plate number Malik had written down and felt something moving through him that he hadn't felt in years, not the cold competence that usually governed how he handled threats, but something rawer and more corrosive underneath it. Something that had no clean professional category. He drove back to the warehouse and found Jin-soo in the rear office reviewing inventory manifests, which was what Jin-soo did when he was waiting for a conversation to arrive at him, rather than going to find it. Do-hwan set his phone on the desk with the plate number visible. Jin-soo looked at it. "Malik spotted the car," Do-hwan said. "Outside Zuri's house. Twice." Jin-soo picked up the phone and studied the partial without changing his expression. "How long has the boy been watching?" "Long enough. He's observant. He gets it from his mother." Do-hwan pulled out the chair across from Jin-soo and sat down. "I need to know whose car that is. I need to know by tomorrow morning. And I need to know who authorized any kind of surveillance on that address, because I made it explicitly clear." "I delivered the message," Jin-soo said. "Then someone didn't receive it." Jin-soo set the phone down. He was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that meant he was making a calculation about how much to say and in what order. Do-hwan recognized that quiet. He'd been reading Jin-soo for 20 years. "Say it," Do-hwan said. "There's been some reorganization of communication within the operation in the last 3 weeks, since the divorce became known." "What kind of reorganization?" "Informal. The way these things always start." Jin-soo's hands were flat on the desk. Certain conversations began happening outside the normal structure. Men talking to each other, rather than through the appropriate channels. It isn't insubordination, exactly. More like uncertainty looking for something to organize around. Do-hwan looked at him. "Who is the center of these conversations?" Jin-soo was quiet again. "Jin-soo, a man named Ri," Jin-soo said. "Ri Sung-min." Do-hwan went very still. Ri Sung-min was not a peripheral figure in his organization. He was Do-hwan's operations director for the Pacific Northwest, the man responsible for coordinating the interface between the legitimate logistics business and the infrastructure underneath it. He had been in that position for 9 years. Do-hwan had elevated him personally, over the objections of 2 older men who had questioned Ri's loyalty. Do-hwan had defended that decision in a room where defending people had consequences. Ri, Do-hwan said. The word came out flat and specific. "He's been in contact with the Tacoma arrangement directly, without routing through you or me." Jin-soo paused. "And he's been speaking to the men who are worried about the divorce, telling them that the leadership is distracted, that decisions are being made from," he used the phrase, "a compromised emotional position." The room was very quiet. "How long have you known this?" Do-hwan said. Jin-soo met his eyes. "I confirmed it 48 hours ago. I was still verifying before I brought it to you." 48 hours. I didn't want to come to you with a partial picture. Do-hwan stood up slowly. He walked to the window that faced the warehouse floor, put his hands in his pockets, and looked at men moving pallets in the ordinary way of a legitimate business that happened to sit on top of something that was neither ordinary nor legitimate. He had trusted Ri with 9 years of operational knowledge. Ri knew the Tacoma arrangement intimately. He knew the port contacts. He knew the routing structures that moved product through the legitimate channels without leaving obvious traces. He knew the names of people whose names were not in any written document. He also knew where Do-hwan's family lived. The car outside Zuri's house, Do-hwan said, still facing the window. If that plate traces back to anyone connected to Ri, I'll know by tomorrow morning. Do-hwan turned around. Get me Ri's location for tonight. Jin-soo looked at him carefully. What are you going to do? I'm going to talk to him. I said I'm going to talk to him. Jin-soo held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. He has dinner on Tuesday evenings at a restaurant in Belltown. Private room in the back. He'll be there from 7 to 9. Do-hwan checked his watch. It was 3:40 in the afternoon. I'll be there at 8, he said. He went home first, changed out of the clothes he'd worn to meet Malik. There was something about arriving to a conversation like this in clothes that carried the weight of the previous conversation that felt wrong, not tactically, just wrong, in some way he couldn't articulate and didn't try to. He stood in the closet of the mansion for a moment and looked at the empty space on Zuri's side. She'd taken most of her things, left a few items on hangers, a dress he recognized from an event 3 years ago, a cardigan she probably forgot, one pair of shoes pushed to the back corner. He closed the closet door. He drove to Belltown. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't advertise. No sign outside except a street number. The front room seated 30 and operated as a legitimate, unremarkable Italian place with decent food and low lighting. The private room in the back was accessed through a door beside the kitchen that looked like a storage entrance. And Ri had been using it for Tuesday dinners for 4 years. Because privacy in this business was a habit you maintained even when you didn't need it, so that when you needed it, the habit was already there. Do-hwan arrived at 8:03 and walked through the front room without stopping. The host at the front recognized him and stepped aside. The kitchen staff knew better than to react. He pushed through the door beside the kitchen and entered the private room. Ri was there with 2 other men, mid-level figures Do-hwan recognized, men who operated in the overlap between the legitimate shipping operation and the other layer. They were mid-dinner. There was wine on the table. Ri was speaking when the door opened and he stopped, and his face went through several things in rapid succession. The 2 other men saw Do-hwan and stood up immediately. Out, Do-hwan said to them. They were out within 15 seconds, taking their coats with them. Ri didn't stand. He stayed in his chair and put down his fork with care, the deliberate care of a man managing the visible signals of his composure. He was 50, compact, with silver at his temples that made him look more distinguished than he had any right to look, given what he'd apparently been doing for the past several weeks. Do-hwan sat down across from him. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Ri the way he looked at anything he was assessing, without performance, without anger visible on the surface, with the settled patience of a man who already knows what the assessment will conclude and is simply letting the other person understand that. Ri held it for about 40 seconds. You should have called, Ri said. We could have arranged. Whose car is parked outside my wife's house? A beat, barely perceptible. But Do-hwan had spent 20 years reading barely perceptible things. I don't know what you're referring to. Try again. Ri's jaw moved slightly. Do-hwan, whatever you've heard. I haven't heard anything. My son wrote down a plate number from his mother's front window. My 17-year-old son. Do-hwan's voice had not changed in volume or pitch since he'd entered the room. It stayed exactly where it was, which was the thing that made it effective. He noticed the car because he's been paying attention to everything since his mother told him about our organization. Because his mother told him the truth. And the first thing he noticed when he started paying attention was a car sitting outside her new house. Ri looked at him. That house has nothing to do with our business, Do-hwan said. That woman has nothing to do with our business. I was explicit. Jin-soo was explicit. If you authorized any kind of presence near that address. I authorized protection, Ree said. Do-hwan stopped. Protection, he said. The situation has become uncertain. The divorce is public within our operation now. There are conversations happening not just here, it's the wider structure about what this means. About whether the separation creates exposure, about whether people outside the organization now have access to information that I told Jinsu to shut those conversations down. You can't shut down a question by telling people not to ask it. Ree leaned forward slightly. Do-hwan, I have been running your Pacific Northwest operations for 9 years. I have managed things in this organization that never reached your desk because I understood they didn't need to. I have done this job with complete loyalty to you and to the structure your father built. And right now, from where I'm sitting, the structure is not stable. The structure is fine. The structure is being managed by a man who just had his family leave him, who is making decisions about withdrawing from key operations based on. Ree stopped himself. Based on personal considerations. And the men below me need to see stability. What I put outside your wife's house was a precaution. To make sure she wasn't a vulnerability. Do-hwan looked at him. Say that again, Do-hwan said quietly. I'm trying to protect the operation. You put surveillance on my wife and children, and you're calling it protection. You are calling it whatever word makes it sound like a decision you had the authority to make. Do-hwan put both hands flat on the table. You do not have that authority. You have never had that authority. Nothing in 9 years of working for me gave you the authority to make a decision about my family. Ree met his eyes, and Do-hwan saw something in there that he should have looked for sooner, that Jinsu's 48-hour verification window had probably been trying to find a gentle way to show him. Ree wasn't afraid. A man who had been caught overstepping by the person he answered to should have some register of fear in his eyes, some recalibration, some immediate return to the subordinate position. Ree had none of that. What Ree had was the look of a man who has already made a larger decision and is now simply in the middle of executing it. Sit down, Ree said. Do-hwan did not sit down. He was already sitting. What Ree meant was something else, the other kind of sit down. The kind that meant, let me tell you how this is actually going to go. There are men in this organization who have decided that the current situation requires a different kind of management, Reese said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but the deference had come out of it. Not permanently, not dramatically. A stabilization period. While things are uncertain, what men? It doesn't matter who specifically. It absolutely matters. What matters is that the Tacoma arrangement, the Incheon routing, the 3 port contacts in Vancouver, these things require continuity of leadership that is not compromised by. He paused, choosing his word. By sentiment. Do-hwan looked at him for a long moment. You're making a move, Do-hwan said. Ree didn't answer. You've been talking to the Tacoma arrangement directly. You've built a coalition of men who are positioning this as a stability issue while actually rearranging the lines of authority. You put surveillance on Zuri to determine whether she's a threat to the operation, which means you're already treating this like your operation to protect. Do-hwan paused. How long have you been building this? It's not what you're... How long, Ree? Ree looked at him. The dinner was still on the table. The wine was going warm. Somewhere in the kitchen behind the door, there was the sound of ordinary restaurant's business plates, voices, the particular noise of a working kitchen. 8 months, Ree said. 8 months. Do-hwan absorbed that. 8 months ago, the divorce hadn't been filed. Zuri hadn't yet spoken to the lawyer. 8 months ago, Do-hwan had been living in the mansion and running the operation, and not yet reading a letter that would take him apart. 8 months ago, Ree had looked at him and seen something Do-hwan hadn't known was visible yet. Why? Do-hwan said. Because you were already pulling back. Before the divorce, before any of this. Ree's voice had taken on a quality that was almost not quite, but almost regretful. You've been distracted for longer than a few weeks, Do-hwan. Your father built this organization with absolute focus. You have been operating with divided attention for a long time. And when a structure loses its center, someone has to hold it. I am the center. You are a man who spent 11 years in a marriage that was slowly leaving him, and you didn't see it until she was already gone. Ri said it without cruelty, which was almost worse than cruelty. If you couldn't see what was happening in your own house, how clearly were you seeing what was happening in your organization? The silence in the room was total. Do-hwan sat across from a man he had elevated, defended, trusted for 9 years, and heard his own blindness described back to him with a precision he couldn't argue with. He could not argue with it because it was true. That was the specific horror of it. Ri was wrong about the solution, and wrong about his authority, and wrong about every action he had taken, and also completely right about the diagnosis. I want the surveillance pulled, Do-hwan said. Tonight. Do-hwan tonight. And then we are going to have a very different conversation about what happens to the Tacoma arrangement and the coalition you've been building, and every single man who thought this was an appropriate direction to move in without my knowledge. Ri looked at him with that absence of fear that was more alarming the longer Do-hwan sat with it. The surveillance comes down, Ri said carefully, when I'm satisfied that the situation is stable. The temperature in the room dropped. You don't set the conditions, Do-hwan said. I think, Ri said, that the situation has moved beyond who sets conditions. Do-hwan drove back to the mansion at 9:47 and called Jin-soo. The plate, he said the moment Jin-soo picked up. It traces to a man named Kwon, mid-level. He runs the Belltown distribution contact, a pause. He reports to Ri. I know, I spoke to Ri. Silence on Jin-soo's end. How bad, Jin-soo said. 8 months. He's had 8 months. Do-hwan stood in the front hallway of the mansion with his coat still on. He's got the Tacoma arrangement, talking directly to him. He's got men convinced this is a stability issue. He put Kwon outside Zuri's house under the framing of protecting the operation. Jin-soo was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the register it used for serious operational problems. Do you trust me? Jin-soo said. Completely. Then listen carefully. Ri has not moved yet. What he has built is a position, not an action. He is waiting to see how you respond before he decides whether to advance or retreat. If you move against him too quickly and without enough support, you confirm the narrative he's been building that you're reactive, compromised, operating from emotion. Jin-soo paused. But if you wait too long, he reads it as weakness and he moves. So what's the window? 72 hours. Maybe less. You need to spend that time doing 2 things. Identifying which men in the operation are genuinely loyal to you versus loyal to stability in the abstract, which means loyal to whoever holds the structure. And you need to remove Zuri and the children from the equation completely. Not protection detail, complete removal. Somewhere Ri's people can't reach them while this resolves. Do-hwan's hand tightened on the phone. She's not going to want to hear from me right now, he said. That's not the relevant factor. She left to get away from this world. I am not going to show up at her door and tell her that her new house needs to be evacuated because the man who ran my operations for 9 years has decided to make a move. Do-hwan. Jin-soo's voice was as patient and implacable as it had been for 30 years. She has already been in the equation for 8 months without knowing it. What you're deciding now is whether she knows it and can make choices accordingly, or whether she doesn't know it and cannot. He stood in the front hallway. The mansion was quiet around him in all its expensively furnished rooms that Zuri had decorated and chosen and lived in for 11 years, and then walked away from without looking in the rearview mirror. He thought about her face on the porch, the gray sweater, the curtains she hadn't chosen. There's something else, Jin-soo said. Do-hwan waited. Ri didn't start this 8 months ago, on his own initiative. Jin-soo's voice had gone careful, in a way that Do-hwan recognized as the voice he used when delivering the information he was most reluctant to deliver. He had a conversation, about 18 months ago, splitting, with someone who gave him reason to believe the current leadership was going to become manageable within a reasonable time frame. Who? A man connected to the Vancouver port contact. Someone outside our structure. Jin-soo paused. Someone who appears to have had information about your marriage. About the trajectory of it. Information specific enough that they were able to predict, 18 months ago, that a separation was coming. Do-hwan's mind went very still. How specific, he said. specific enough to include a rough timeline. Jinsu's voice was almost gentle. Specific enough that Ri began positioning himself 8 months ago because he'd been told to expect an opening. Someone told Ri, my marriage was ending 18 months ago. Someone who knew enough about the inside of your household to predict it with accuracy. A sound like green wood splitting. Do-hwan stood in the front hallway of the mansion and looked at the hook where his keys hung, and the table where Zuri used to leave the children's school papers, and the mirror on the wall where he had stood hundreds of times and seen his own face looking back at him in the morning. Someone who knew enough about the inside of his household. Who has access to that kind of information? Do-hwan said slowly. About my personal life. About what was happening between Zuri and me. That's what I've been trying to determine for the last 48 hours, Jinsu said. And I have a name, but I need you to sit down before I tell you. I'm already sitting. Do-hwan, you need to actually sit down. He walked to the kitchen, sat in the chair at the head of the table, where he had sat for 11 years, eating dinners that had gone cold or not been eaten at all. The chair where he had told Zuri the operation was complicated. The chair where she had slid the divorce, filing across the table at him. Telsey, he said. Jinsu told him. The name Jinsu said was not the name of a man in his organization. It was not the name of a rival. It was not the name of anyone in the external business world who might have had motivation to destabilize his leadership. It was the name of a person Do-hwan had trusted with the interior of his life in a way he trusted almost no one. A person who had been present in his home, at his table, at family events, at the ordinary private moments that accumulated over years into the complete picture of who Baek Do-hwan was behind the controlled exterior. The name Jinsu said was someone Zuri also trusted. Someone their children knew. Do-hwan sat at the kitchen table with the phone against his ear and felt something break open inside him that he didn't have a name for. That was different from anything he'd felt when he read the letter, or stood on the porch, or listened to his son tell him to fix it. This was not grief. This was not guilt. This was the specific devastation of a man who has just discovered that the most dangerous betrayal of his life came not from an enemy, but from someone who had sat in the empty chair at his daughter's concert and held his son's hand at a school graduation and looked him in the eye every time they spoke with an expression that he had read as loyalty, but was something else entirely, and had been something else entirely for a very long time. Are you certain? Do-hwan said. Yes, Jinsu said. Do-hwan set the phone on the table. He sat in the kitchen of the empty mansion, and he looked at the wall across from him, and he understood that the restructuring he'd discussed with Jinsu, the plan he'd formed in the warehouse office, the 72-hour window, and the loyal versus stable calculation, all of it had just been overtaken by a fact that changed the shape of everything. Because if this person had been feeding information to the outside for 18 months, then Ri's coalition wasn't the primary problem. The primary problem was that somewhere in the life Do-hwan had built not the criminal infrastructure, not the logistics empire, but the personal life, the family life, the life that was supposed to be separate from all of it. There was a source. And that source had access to Zuri. He picked up the phone. He called Zuri's number for the first time since she'd moved to the new house. It rang 4 times. He had not expected her to pick up. He was already forming what he would say to her voicemail, the words that would convey urgency without panic. When the line connected, Do-hwan, her voice was quiet and careful, not warm but not closed. The voice of a woman who had anticipated that this call would come eventually and had decided in advance to answer. I need you to listen to me, he said. A pause. I'm listening, she said. He told her as much as she needed to know, and no more than that, which was still more than he had ever told her in 11 years of marriage. Splitting. And when he was finished, the line was silent for long enough that he thought she might have set the phone down. Then she said, You're telling me that someone in our life. Yes, someone who knows me. Yes, someone who has been around my children. Zuri, say yes or no. Yes, he said. The silence on her end was different from every other silence he'd heard from her. It didn't have the quality of her composure that he'd spent 11 years reading as patience. It had the quality of a person standing at the edge of something they had genuinely not prepared for, looking down at the distance. Tell me the name, she said. he told her. And for the first time since she had signed those papers, without a single visible crack in her face, Zuri Adebayo made a sound that was not controlled and not managed and not the product of 11 years of learning how to perform through whatever the day required of her. It was small, just one breath, caught and released. But Do-hwan heard it, and it was the worst thing he had heard in the entire disaster of the past several weeks. Kasians understood that he had just delivered to the woman who had left him to protect herself and her children the information that the danger had been inside the house long before she ever walked out of it. The name Do-hwan had spoken was Daniel Yoon. Zuri sat on the edge of her bed in the small house with the wrong curtains and held the phone against her ear and said nothing for a long time after Do-hwan said it. Daniel Yoon had been Do-hwan's personal attorney for 7 years. He was 44, Korean-American, third generation, Yale-educated, with an office in downtown Seattle and a reputation as one of the most discreet legal minds in the Pacific Northwest. He had handled the Adebayo Baek household's personal legal matters, estate planning, the children's trusts, property arrangements with a precision and attentiveness that Zuri had always found reassuring. He had also been the attorney she had called 6 weeks before filing for divorce, not to represent her. She had used a separate family law attorney for the actual filing. But she had called Daniel first, because Daniel was the name she had when she thought of someone in the legal world she trusted. And she had asked him one question, whether Do-hwan's assets were structured in a way that would complicate a separation. She had told him she was asking hypothetically. She had believed he would treat it as confidential. She sat on her bed and understood that he had not. Zuri, Do-hwan said on the phone. Don't, she said. Give me a minute. She needed more than a minute. She needed to go back 18 months and unmake a phone call she had made from her car, parked down the block from the mansion, because she had wanted to be careful and thorough, and she had reached for the name she trusted. The name that had been feeding information to a man named Ri, who had used it to begin building a position inside Do-hwan's organization, who had put a car outside her new house, who apparently saw her as a variable in a calculation that had been running for a year and a half without her knowledge. She had left to get safe. She had made the call that started all of this while she was still in the process of trying to get safe. He knew about my call to him, she said. It wasn't a question. He used it. He told Ri you were already consulting about separation. That gave Ri a timeline. How much did he give them? We don't know the full scope yet. Do-hwan. Her voice came out harder than she intended. How much did he give them? A pause. Enough that Ri knew the marriage was effectively over before either of us had said it out loud. Enough that he had 8 months to build while I was still, while I hadn't yet understood what was happening. She stood up. She couldn't sit still for this conversation. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. Quiet, residential, a neighbor's porch light on, and checked automatically for a parked car that didn't belong. She had started doing that, without realizing she'd started. The children, she said. They need to move. Tonight. I have a location, a property that is completely clean, no connection to my operation, registered under a name that doesn't trace back to me or anyone in my organization. Jin Soo arranged it years ago for a different purpose, and it's never been used. You want me to take my children in the middle of the night to a property your man arranged. I want you to take your children somewhere. Ri's people cannot find them while I resolve this. While you resolve this, she repeated. The words tasted like something old and familiar, and exhausted. That's the sentence I spent 11 years living inside, Do-hwan. While I resolve this. That was always the sentence. Zuri, I know this is different. I know the stakes are different. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass. Cold from the outside. Where is this property? He told her. It was in Snohomish County, 40 minutes north. A house on a private road, nothing notable about it, nothing that would draw attention. I'll send Cho to drive you, he said. I don't want your security details. He's already outside. He has been since I left the coffee shop with Malik. She turned from the window. Cho has been outside my house all day. Since 4 this afternoon. And you didn't tell me. I didn't want to alarm you until I knew what I was dealing with. She stood in the middle of her bedroom, in the small house she had rented 3 weeks ago, with money she had saved quietly and carefully for 4 years, and she looked at the walls she'd chosen, and the furniture she'd bought, and the life she had begun constructing with deliberate patience. And she felt the particular helplessness of a person who has done everything correctly and still found themselves back in some situation they were once turning. They worked methodically to escape. "Wake the children," she said. "Zuri, I'll handle that. You handle your side." She paused. "And Do-hwan, when this is over, when whatever you're about to do is finished, you and I are going to have a conversation that has nothing to do with your organization, or Ri or Daniel Yoon. We are going to talk about what comes after. For Malik and Ariel. You understand?" "Yes." "Good." She ended the call. She stood for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she moved. Do-hwan called Jin-soo the moment Zuri hung up. "She'll move in the next 30 minutes. Cho is there. I need the Snohomish property confirmed clean, and I need 2 men I trust completely at the perimeter by the time she arrives." "Already arranged. The property has been ready since 9. A pause. "How is she?" "She's Zuri. She's handling it." He picked up his car keys. "Where is Ri right now?" "He left the Belltown restaurant at 9:15. He went to the warehouse in Tacoma. The Tacoma warehouse. At 9 in the evening, he has a meeting. I don't have the full attendee list, but I have 2 names. Both are men who have been in Ri's orbit for the last several months." Do-hwan put on his coat and Daniel Yoon his office. "He's been there since 7. He had a call at 8 that lasted 40 minutes. I don't know who he was speaking to. I want him held. Not harmed. Held. Do-hwan Yoon is an attorney. I said held. I want him in a room where he can't make calls or receive them until I've dealt with Ri. After that, I'll deal with Yoon separately and carefully, and in a way that doesn't create additional problems." He walked out of the mansion to his car. The men at the Tacoma meeting. "How many of them do you believe are genuinely committed to Ri versus men who got pulled into conversations without understanding what they were committing to?" Jin-soo was quiet for a moment. "Honest assessment? Most of them are in the second category. Ri is good at framing things as concerns rather than as choices. Men agree to a concern before they realize they've agreed to a position. Then I need to be in that room. I need to be in that room, Jin-soo. Not to confront Ri in front of them. To remind the men who are on the edge of a mistake what their actual options are." Another pause. "If Ri has already moved further than we think, walking into that warehouse puts you in a confined space with men whose current loyalty is unknown." "I know that." I know that," he said again. Set it up. The drive to Tacoma took 40 minutes on the I-5 at that hour. Do-hwan drove himself. Jin-soo had offered a driver, and he had declined because he needed the 40 minutes to think, and he couldn't think with another person in the car. He drove south on the interstate and thought about 8 months. About what Ri had seen in him 8 months ago that had looked like the beginning of an opening. What it meant that Ri had watched him for a year and a half and identified the marriage as the structural vulnerability before Do-hwan himself had fully admitted it was ending. He thought about Zuri sitting in the mansion in those years, keeping the household together, raising Malik and Ariel through birthdays and school concerts and ordinary illnesses, and the small daily crises of childhood, while Do-hwan ran an empire that she was simultaneously embedded inside and completely excluded from. She had called Daniel Yoon because she trusted him. She had trusted him because Do-hwan had brought Yoon into their lives. Yoon was Do-hwan's introduction. Do-hwan's recommendation. Do-hwan had told her, at some point years ago, that Yoon was the most reliable man in his professional circle when it came to personal matters. He had been wrong, and the wrongness of that judgment had followed his wife into a car 6 weeks ago, while she had drove to a lawyer's office to file papers that were supposed to make her life simpler. He took the exit for Tacoma. The warehouse was a legitimate facility on the surface, which was the point. It moved real cargo through real shipping channels and employed real workers who arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 4 in the afternoon and had no idea what the rear offices were used for in the evenings. Do-hwan had acquired it 12 years ago as part of the infrastructure expansion, and it had served its purpose without incident. He parked outside and called Jin-soo. "How many in the meeting?" 7, including Ri. 2 of them are men I'd call committed to him. The other 4 are edge cases. Who's running the door? A man named Pak. He's been with the operation for 4 years. His loyalty is to structure, not specifically to Ri. So he'll let me through. I believe so. Though Ri will know the moment you're inside. That's fine. I want him to know. Do-hwan looked at the warehouse entrance. Give me 5 minutes. Then call Pak and tell him I'm coming. He sat in the car for 5 minutes. He was not composing himself, he was already composed. The way he was always composed in the moments before a difficult room, with the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself to keep everything that matters internal. But he spent the 5 minutes doing something he rarely did. He thought about Ariel. He thought about her voice in that school auditorium, clear and unwavering, performing through an empty seat. He thought about Malik at the coffee table writing down a license plate number with 17-year-old hands because he had started paying attention to everything. He thought about Zuri waking tonight in the small house and packing bags again and loading them into a car and driving north because the world Do-hwan had built had found them in the only place she'd tried to make safe. He got out of the car. Pak was at the warehouse entrance. 32, solid, with the face of a man who processed everything he saw without reacting to most of it. He looked at Do-hwan and stepped aside. Do-hwan walked through the main floor. The legitimate cargo was stacked and labeled and quiet at this hour. The machinery was off. His footsteps on the concrete were the only sound until he reached the rear corridor and heard voices from behind the meeting room door. He opened the door without knocking. The 7 men inside went instantly silent. They were around a table that had been arranged for a working meeting, papers, laptops, a whiteboard with routing structures that Do-hwan recognized and that had no business being in a room without him. Ri was at the head of the table, and his face, when he saw Do-hwan, performed something that was almost composed but not quite. 4 of the 6 non-Ri men looked like they wished they were somewhere else. The other 2, the committed ones Jin-soo had flagged, straightened almost imperceptibly. Do-hwan looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the routing structures. He looked at Ri. "Get out," he said to the room. Not to Ri. To the other 6. 4 of them moved immediately. The 2 committed ones stayed seated and looked at Ri. Ri shook his head slightly. "They can hear whatever." "I wasn't speaking to you," Do-hwan said. "I was speaking to them. And they can make a decision right now about what's staying in this room when I've asked them to leave means for their futures in this organization." The 2 committed men looked at each other. Then they looked at Ri. Then they stood up and left. The door closed. Do-hwan and Ri were alone. Ri stood up from the head of the table. He was trying to reclaim something by standing, but the whiteboard behind him with its restructured routing was not helping his position. "You shouldn't have come here tonight," Ri said. "You shouldn't have had a meeting. This is an operational necessity." Ri. Do-hwan walked to the whiteboard and looked at it. He recognized the structure. He recognized what it was doing. The Tacoma arrangement had been redrawn to route upward through a different management node. Through Ri's node specifically. "How long did you think this would take before I noticed?" "This isn't what it..." Stop. Do-hwan turned from the whiteboard. "Don't do that. You are too intelligent for that sentence, and I am too tired of being lied to by people I trusted." His voice was still controlled. It took effort to keep it controlled. "Tell me what you actually thought was going to happen." Ri's jaw worked. "I thought you were going to keep pulling back. From the operation, from the decisions, and that someone needed to maintain the infrastructure while this personal situation resolved. So you decided that person was you. Someone had to. And you decided that without asking me, without coming to me. After 9 years, I came to you at the Belltown restaurant and you threatened me. I told you to pull the surveillance off my wife's house, and I told you that you didn't have authority to put it there. That's not a threat. That's a fact." Ri looked at him directly. The deference was fully gone now, and what was underneath it was not hostile exactly, but certain. The certainty of a man who has committed to a position. "The surveillance was for operational security," Ri said. "The surveillance was to determine whether Zuri was a threat to the operation's stability. Which means you were already treating her as a subject of this organization. Which means you had already drawn her inside the perimeter in your mind. Do-hwan took one step toward him. Just one. She is not inside the perimeter. She was never inside the perimeter. She was a woman who married into this life before she understood what it was and who spent 11 years trying to keep our children separate from it. And she is now a woman who left and is trying to build something clean. He stopped. And you sent a man to sit outside her house. If she doesn't know anything specific. She knows names. She knows faces. She knows what it looks like to attend a charity dinner with her husband. She knows what certain men look like in a social context. She has no knowledge of operations, routing, structures, contacts, arrangements. Nothing. Do-hwan's voice had dropped further, which was worse than it rising. A sound, if you had come to me with your concerns about exposure rather than building an 8-month position while feeding information through Daniel Yoon to people outside this organization, I would have told you that. Something moved across Ri's face at the mention of Yoon. You know about Yoon, Ri said. I know about Yoon. Ri sat down slowly. The certainty in his face had taken a crack. Just one. Yoon approached me, not the other direction. Yoon had been tracking the household situation he had access. Do-hwan. He's been handling your personal legal matters for 7 years and he told me what he was seeing because he thought it was operationally relevant. And you agreed with him. I agreed that it was information I needed. You agreed that it was an opportunity. Do-hwan sat down across from him. Ri, look at me. I have known you for 9 years. I have trusted you with things I trusted almost no one with. And I am sitting here right now, and I am asking you not as the man who runs this organization, but as the person who vouched for you in rooms where vouching had consequences, did you believe you were protecting this operation? Or did you see a moment and decide to take it? A long silence. Ri looked at the table. Both, he said finally. It was both. Do-hwan looked at him. Thank you for that, he said quietly. Then he stood up and called Jin-soo. The 2 men who left this room 5 minutes ago, Do-hwan said when Jin-soo picked up. I need them detained separately. Not harmed. Detained. And I need you here in the next 30 minutes. He paused. Bring Park from the main office. He'll know who to call. Ri had gone still across the table. What happens now? Ri said. Now we spend the next few hours making sure every man in this organization understands clearly where the lines are. Do-hwan put the phone in his pocket. And then I deal with Yoon. Yoon isn't going to... Yoon is a lawyer who used his access to a client's personal life to feed information to a third party for strategic purposes. That's not a complicated situation. That's a disbarment, minimum. Do-hwan looked at him. I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to bury him professionally and legally, and in every way that a man in his position can be buried. And he will spend the next portion of his career explaining himself to the state bar. He paused. I am not my father, Ri. I never was. My father would have handled this differently, and you know that, which is partly why you thought this window was real. Ri looked at him. Are you letting me walk out of here? Ri said. You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to spend the next several months working a transition under Jin-soo's oversight, with every decision reviewed before it executes. At the end of that period, if your work has been clean, you'll be separated from this organization with arrangements that reflect 9 years of service. Do-hwan held his gaze. If at any point during that period you make contact with outside parties, with the Vancouver connection, with anyone out the structure without prior approval, that changes. You're not going to, Ri. Stop asking me to say things I've already said by implication. You were in this organization long enough to understand that I mean what I say without the explicit threat attached. Do-hwan stood. Jin-soo will be here in 20 minutes. Wait here. He walked toward the door. Do-hwan. He stopped but didn't turn. The Vancouver connection, Ri said. The outside party that Yoon was routing information to. It's not just a business interest. A pause. They've been building a relationship with the Tacoma arrangement for 14 months. Deeper than I told you tonight. Do-hwan turned. How deep, he said. Deep enough that unwinding it is not a clean operation. Ri's voice had taken on the quality of a man who has decided that full disclosure is the only remaining currency he has. They have documentation, records of certain transactions that they've been collecting through the Tacoma connection. I don't know the full scope, but I know they've been building a file. The weight of that settled in the room. Documentation. Records. A file being built by outside parties with 14 months of access through a channel that ran through Ri's operations. Who is the Vancouver connection, Do-hwan said. Ri told him. It was not a name Do-hwan recognized from the criminal world. It was a name he recognized from the federal level. Not law enforcement, not an agency. Splitting. A private entity that worked adjacent to federal interests, the kind of organization that operated in the space between legitimate investigation and the kind of intelligence gathering that didn't require warrants because it was conducted by private parties who then shared findings with interested government bodies. The room felt smaller. They're building a case, Do-hwan said. Not a question. I believe so. Yes. And Yoon has been feeding them information about the household. About my personal situation. As part of this, Yoon is working with them. I don't know the full arrangement. Do-hwan stood at the door of the warehouse meeting room and absorbed this. Ri's internal positioning, the surveillance on Zuri, the coalition of uncertain men. All of it had been the immediate crisis, the thing inside his organization that needed to be addressed. But underneath that was something larger. An outside entity with 14 months of documentation connected to federal interests, building a file on Baek Do-hwan's operation through access that ran through his own lawyer, through the personal trust of a man who had sat at his dinner table. He pulled out his phone. He called Jin-soo again. Change of timeline, he said when Jin-soo picked up. I need you here now, and I need the attorney, my personal attorney, not Yoon, the other one on the phone within the hour. What's happened? The Vancouver connection is federal adjacent. They have documentation, 14 months. Jin-soo was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was the longest Jin-soo had ever been quiet. Zuri and the children, Jin-soo said. They're moving. They're safe. If this is federal adjacent and they have a file. I know. Do-hwan. If they have that kind of documentation, and they've been building for 14 months, then the restructuring you were planning isn't fast enough. The timeline just compressed. I know that too. How compressed? Do-hwan looked at the whiteboard with Ri's routing structures drawn on it in dry erase marker, neat and confident and already obsolete. Get me the attorney, he said, and then call Zuri. You want me to call her? Tell her. He stopped. He thought about what to tell her, about what was true that was also something she could use, that wouldn't terrify her in the middle of driving her children to a property in Snohomish County at 11 at night. Tell her I'm handling it. Tell her she's safe. Tell her I'll call her in the morning when I have more. And if she asks for details, she'll ask for details. Yes. Tell her the truth, that I'm in Tacoma, that the situation is more complicated than I initially understood, and that I will call her personally in the morning. He paused. She'll know I mean it. She's always known when I mean something. He hung up. He turned back to Ri, who had been sitting at the table through all of this, with the face of a man who is recalculating his options in real time. The Vancouver connection, Do-hwan said. The private entity. Who is their primary contact person? The individual. Ri told him. Do-hwan knew the name, knew it from a professional context 3 years ago, a minor overlap in a business negotiation that had resolved cleanly. He hadn't thought of the name since. He was thinking about it now. When they reached out to Yoon, Do-hwan said, was it Yoon who went to them or them who came to Yoon? They came to him, 18 months ago, right around the time. Right around the time Zuri called Yoon, asking a hypothetical question about asset structure. Ri nodded slowly. So they were already watching, Do-hwan said. Already positioned. Yoon wasn't recruited. He was approached because he was already a known access point. That's my understanding. Do-hwan looked at the ceiling of the warehouse meeting room, at the industrial lighting and the bare concrete above it, and thought about 18 months of a file being built. He sat in the mansion and read shipping manifests and missed birthday dinners and believed that the separation between his family life and his professional life was real and maintained and sufficient. It had never been real. The separation had been a story he told himself the way Zuri had told herself that silence protected the children. Partly true. Also, a form of fear. The The fear of admitting that once you are in a thing this deeply, truly, architecturally, the thing is in everything, including the parts you told yourself were separate. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize that contained 4 words. 4 words that made the blood in his hands go cold. He read them twice. Then he walked out of the meeting room through the warehouse corridor, across the main floor where the legitimate cargo sat in the legitimate dark, and out into the parking lot where his car was the only vehicle, and the Tacoma night was damp and smelled like salt water from the nearby port. He read the 4 words a third time. We have the letter. He stood in the parking lot and understood, in the span of approximately 4 seconds, what those words meant and what they changed. Zuri's letter. The letter she had left on his desk. The letter he had read 4 nights after she left, and then read again and again in the silence of the mansion. A private intelligence entity, with access through his own lawyer to the interior of his household, had the letter his wife had written him. Not the contents described, not a summary. The letter itself, which meant someone had been inside the mansion, or had an agent close enough to photograph or copy a document from his private desk. And the letter Zuri's handwriting, Zuri's words, Zuri describing 11 years of a marriage, lived beside a man whose criminal empire she had watched consume him in the wrong hands, was not just a personal document. It was evidence of her knowledge, her proximity, her 11 years of adjacency to every room she hadn't been allowed inside, but had been standing next to. It made her a witness. He called Zuri. She picked up on the first ring this time. "Stop the car," he said. Zuri had already pulled over. Not because Do-hwan told her to. Not because Do-hwan told her to. No. The moment she answered the phone and had eased the car onto the shoulder of the highway without being asked, which was why Do-hwan had chosen Cho specifically for this, and why Cho had been doing this work for 6 years without a single significant error. Ariel was asleep in the back seat. Malik was not asleep. He was sitting with his back straight and his hands in his lap and his eyes on his mother's face in the front seat, reading her the way he had learned to read everything, quietly, completely, without letting on how much he was taking in. "Say that again," Zuri said. "They have the letter," Do-hwan said. "The letter you left on my desk. Someone accessed the mansion. I don't know when. I don't know how, and they have it." She was quiet, Zuri. "I'm thinking," she said. He waited. He knew how to wait for now. He knew how to wait for her now in a way for most of their marriage, when he had always filled her silences with his own words, because her silences made him feel like he was losing ground. "Who has it?" she said. "A private intelligence organization. They're building a file on my operation. They've been working through Yoon for 18 months. He paused. "The letter in their hands positions you as someone with knowledge of the operation." "It would make," she said. "Yes." Another silence. He could hear her breathing, could hear the highway outside the car, the occasional rush of a truck passing. "What do they want?" she said. "I don't know yet." The text was 4 words. No demands, no contact information. Just the 4 words to let me know they have it. So they're not federal. Federal doesn't send texts to tell you what they have. Federal shows up with warrants. He was already moving through the parking lot, back toward his car as he spoke. This is leverage. They're building a position. They want something. They want you to cooperate, she said, or stop resisting. Or what do private intelligence organizations want when they've spent 14 months building a file on someone? Usually they want to be paid to make the file disappear. Or they want cooperation with whoever hired them to build it. And who hired them? That's what I'm going to find out tonight. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite anything else, a short exhale that carried 11 years into versions of this sentence. Do-hwan, she said. I know. The children keep moving. Go to the Snohomish property. Cho knows it. You'll be safe there until morning. He reached his car and got in. I will call you before 6 a.m. with whatever I have. And if you don't call by 6, he started the car. I will call by 6, he said. He could hear that she didn't believe him with the certainty he wanted her to. He didn't blame her. He had told her things would be handled, and then things had not been handled for 11 consecutive years, and one night of genuine urgency didn't erase the accounting. Go, he said. I'll call. She ended the call. He drove. Jin Soo was at the warehouse when Do-hwan got back inside. He had arrived with Park and two other men Do-hwan recognized as being among the most reliably loyal in the operation, not men of significant rank, but men who had been doing their specific jobs with consistency and without political ambition for long enough that their loyalty was to the work rather than to whoever happened to be standing at the top. Do-hwan showed Jin Soo the text. Jin Soo read it without expression. Then he handed the phone back. The number, Jin Soo said. Traced to a burner. Already tried. Routing. I need your contact at the telecommunications company. Tonight. Jin Soo was already calling. While he was on the phone, Do-hwan sat across from Ri, who had not moved from the meeting room and who had the look of a man who has decided that stillness is the only safe behavior available to him. The Vancouver entity, Do-hwan said. The private intelligence organization. When Yoon was in contact with them, what was the format? Meetings, calls, documents, mostly encrypted communication. They met in person twice that I know of. Once in Vancouver, once here in Seattle. Ri paused. The Seattle meeting was at Yoon's office. When? About 4 months ago. Do-hwan processed that. And the documentation they've been building the 14 months of records, what is the nature of it? Transaction records, communications, operational structure? Transaction records, primarily. Some communication intercepts. I don't know how they got the intercepts. That's beyond what Yoon had access to. Ri looked at the table. They've been working multiple angles. Multiple angles meaning they have sources inside the operation beyond Yoon. Ri didn't answer immediately. Ri, I think so. Yes. I don't know who specifically. Do-hwan sat back. The meeting room was very quiet. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that became noticeable in the silence. You knew this, Do-hwan said. You knew they had sources inside the operation, and you didn't tell me. I didn't know the scope. You knew enough. Do-hwan looked at him steadily. You were building your own position, and you made a calculation that this external entity was a manageable factor, that you could work around it, or that once you had consolidated your own standing, you could deal with them. Ri said nothing, which was its own answer. Instead, Do-hwan said, you used information from Yoon that was already compromised by their access. Which means everything you thought you were building was being observed by the people who hired that organization. The implication of that settled in the room. Ri had been building a position inside Do-hwan's organization while an external intelligence entity watched him do it. Which meant, whatever Ri had done the 8 months of quiet repositioning, the conversations with uncertain men, the Tacoma arrangement restructure on the whiteboard, all of it was in their file too. You weren't taking over my organization, Do-hwan said quietly. You were handing it to them. Ri's face changed. Not the controlled surface. What was underneath it? The place where a man's actual understanding of his situation lives when the constructed version collapses. I didn't know, I know you didn't know. Do-hwan stood. That's the part that's almost worse. Jin Soo came back with a partial trace on the burner's signal, routing, within 40 minutes. It was imprecise, these things always were, but it placed the text's origin in the downtown Seattle area, which was where Yoon's office was, and where any number of other relevant locations were, but which narrowed the geography enough to matter. Do-hwan called his personal attorney, not Yoon, a man named Stedman, who was 58, had practiced federal criminal defense for 30 years, and who received this call at 11:45 at night with the flat composure of someone who had received worse calls at worse hours. Do-hwan gave him the outlines. The private intelligence entity. The 14 months of documentation. The letter. The text. Stedman listened without interrupting. The letter, Stedman said when Do-hwan finished. Yes. Your wife's letter. Yes. And it's in their possession. That's what the text asserts. All right. Stedman was quiet for a moment. The letter itself is not operational intelligence. It's a private document describing a parental relationship. Whatever it contains about your professional life is filtered through the perspective of a spouse, which is to say, it's emotional testimony rather than evidentiary documentation. Any prosecutor worth their salary knows that. He paused. What it does is establish context. It establishes that your wife had awareness of the general nature of your business, which in itself isn't criminal for her. She committed no acts and was not a participant. But it makes her a potential witness for characterization purposes, which is what they want to use it for. Almost certainly, yes. They're not interested in prosecuting your wife. They're interested in using her potential exposure as leverage on you. Another pause. The question is who hired them? Because the nature of what they want from you depends entirely on who is sitting behind this organization. I'm working on that tonight. Call me when you have it. I don't care what time. Do-hwan hung up and looked at Jin-soo. Yoon, he said. Being collected now, Jin-soo said. He'll be at the location within the hour. The location was a building in Sodo that Do-hwan owned through 3 layers of corporate structure, and that Yoon himself had helped establish those structures, which was either ironic or clarifying, depending on how you looked at it. It had an interior office with no windows and furniture that was functional and nothing else, and which was used, on the rare occasions it was used at all, for conversations that needed to happen outside every normal context. Yoon arrived at 12:40 in the morning. He was in a suit jacket over a dress shirt, thus with no tie, which meant they had collected him from somewhere professional rather than his home. His face, when he saw Do-hwan, was doing something complicated, not quite fear, not quite calculation, something in between that kept shifting as he tried to determine what Do-hwan already knew. Do-hwan let him sit. Let the room be quiet for a full minute. Yoon broke first. Whatever you've been told. Stop, Do-hwan said. You're going to listen first, and then you're going to speak. And what you say when you speak is going to determine what the next several years of your life look like. He leaned forward. I know about the Vancouver entity. I know they approached you 18 months ago. I know you've been providing them with information about my household, my personal situation, and most recently a private document that was on my desk in my home. He paused. What I don't yet know is who hired them. You're going to tell me. Yoon looked at him. He was trying to find the angle. Do-hwan could see it happening, the attorney's brains, sorting through options, running outcomes, searching for the version of this conversation where he maintained some leverage. Do-hwan's voice dropped. You accessed my wife's trust. You used a call she made to you in confidence. She called you because she trusted you, and because I had told her you were trustworthy. You used that call to provide a timeline to people who then moved against my organization and put a surveillance vehicle outside a house where my children live. He let that sit for a moment. I am not going to hurt you. I want to be explicit about that because I want you to understand that what I'm about to do to your professional life is going to happen not out of anger, but out of a deliberate and fully considered decision that you absolutely earned. The only question is whether you help me tonight, and that decision is reflected in how thorough the aftermath is. Yoon's hands were on the table. They were still. The entity, Yoon said finally. They were hired by a consortium. Business interests legitimate on the surface. Property development, port access rights, Pacific Trade Corridor licensing. He paused. They've been trying to access certain arrangements in the Tacoma port infrastructure for 3 years. Your operation controls access to those arrangements. They couldn't buy it or negotiate it because you weren't selling. He looked at the table. So they decided to acquire leverage instead. Names, Do-hwan said. Yoon gave him 3 names. 2 were Pacific Northwest commercial real estate figures. Do-hwan recognized men he'd encountered at professional events. Men who occupied the legitimate business world's upper tier, with the right clubs and the right donations and the right reputations. The 3rd name was a man in Vancouver who ran port logistics consulting and who had been making quiet inquiries about Tacoma access for years. Business interests, not federal, not law enforcement. A sound like men who wanted something Do-hwan controlled and had decided that 14 months of surveillance and a private intelligence operation was more cost-effective than whatever they'd been paying in failed negotiations. The letter, Do-hwan said. I had access to the mansion. I'd been there for legal meetings. I knew where your study was. Yoon's voice was flat. I photographed it during a visit 6 weeks ago, before Zuri moved out. You were in the mansion for a meeting about the estate structure. You were there, you let me in, Do-hwan sat with that. He had let Yoon into his house for a legal meeting, and Yoon had photographed a letter on his desk, a letter that hadn't yet been written 6 weeks ago, which meant 6 weeks ago the letter didn't exist, Do-hwan said. Yoon was quiet. Zuri left the letter when she moved out, Do-hwan said slowly, which was 3 weeks ago. So you've been in the mansion since she left. Once. 2 weeks ago, Yoon's voice had gone smaller. They wanted to know if there were documents. Anything relating to the operation. I told them there wasn't, but I found the letter on the disk and you photographed it. Yes, Do-hwan stood up. He walked to the corner of the room, put his back to Yoon, and stood there for a moment, breathing, at a rate that he kept controlled through deliberate effort because the alternative was an expression of what he was feeling that would not serve any purpose and would not get him what he needed. Yoon had been in his house 2 weeks ago, had stood at his desk, had picked up or photographed the letter Zuri had written him. The letter that was the most private document in Do-hwan's possession, the one thing he had read repeatedly in the silence of the mansion because it was the truest account of his life he had ever encountered. He turned around. You are going to provide me with everything you have given that organization, Do-hwan said. Every document, every communication, every summary. Tonight, you're going to write down every name you know connected to this consortium, and you're going to provide a timeline of every piece of information you transferred. He walked back to the table and put both hands on it and leaned forward until he was close enough that Yoon had nowhere to look but at him. And then you are going to spend the rest of your career explaining to the Washington State Bar and whoever else I direct to ask why you violated attorney-client privilege on a 17-year client. Relationship to serve a consortium of commercial interests. I have Stedman. Stedman has colleagues. This is going to be thorough, and it is going to be public, and it is going to follow you. He straightened. Or you can decide not to cooperate tonight, in which case the same thing happens. And you also have the added difficulty of whatever the consortium decides to do when they realize you've been neutralized as an asset. Which, given what you've told me about their methods, I would think carefully about. Yoon looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Give me paper." It took 3 hours. Yoon wrote everything. Jin-soo sat in the room and recorded it additionally because documentation of documentation was the kind of redundancy that Jin-soo understood instinctively. By 4 in the morning, they had a complete picture. Every contact, every transfer of information, every communication with the Vancouver entity, and the full structure of the consortium behind it. Do-hwan sent the names and the structure to Stedman at 4:15. Stedman called back at 4:40. The consortium, Stedman said. The 3 principals. Yes, 2 of them have federal exposure of their own on a separate matter. Unrealized exposure, the relevant agency hasn't moved yet, but there's an open inquiry. A pause. If we bring what you have about their private intelligence operation to the right people, combined with the Tacoma access scheme and Yoon's documentation, the calculus changes significantly for all 3 of them. They approached me to acquire leverage, Do-hwan said. Yes, and in doing so, they created a significant amount of exposure for themselves. The private intelligence operation alone has several violations, depending on how the evidence collection was conducted. Stedman's voice was dry and precise. What they collected about you is less clean than what you now have about them. Do-hwan sat in the Soto office in the 4:40 quiet of an almost finished night. Make it go away, he said. The file they built. The letter. All of it. That's going to require a negotiation. I know. Negotiate. He paused, and Stedman, whatever arrangement resolves this, I want language that is explicit about my wife and children. Explicit about their separation from my professional affairs. Whatever exposure exists related to my operation does not attach to them. That is non-negotiable. Understood, Stedman. Completely non-negotiable. I heard you the first time, Stedman said. I'll make calls at 7 when people are reachable. You should sleep. I'll sleep when this is resolved. Then you won't sleep for several weeks. Go home, Do-hwan. He called Zuri at 5:58. She picked up immediately, which meant she hadn't slept either. It's not federal, he said. It was a business consortium trying to acquire leverage over port access eye control. They hired a private intelligence operation. Yoon was their access point. A silence. Business, she said, yes. Not law enforcement. No. My attorney is already working on a resolution. The file they built the letter will have it back, or destroyed, as part of whatever arrangement Stedman negotiates. He's confident. How confident? Confident enough that he told me to go to sleep. He heard something on her end. Movement. The particular sound of a house in early morning. The children are fine, she said. Ariel slept. Malik didn't. He sat in the kitchen most of the night. Like his mother. He's like both of us, she said. Not warmly, but honestly. Do-hwan was sitting in his car in the Soto parking lot. He had not gone back into the building after finishing with Stedman. He had sat in the car because he didn't know where else to be, and the mansion felt like a thing he couldn't face at 5:58 in the morning after the night he'd had. Zuri, he said. I know, she said. I need to say it anyway. This was my world finding you. I know that. I know that you did everything correctly. I know that you did everything correctly, and that what happened last night, the letter, Yoon, none of it was a consequence of anything you did wrong. It was my world, following you through a door you opened specifically to get away from it. He stopped. I'm sorry, that's not enough. I know it's not enough. But I need you to have heard me say it. The line was quiet for a moment. I heard you, she said. The restructuring I was already planning. I'm accelerating it. Stedman is going to handle the immediate situation, and then the restructuring begins immediately after. It's going to take time. Jin-soo said it correctly. You can't unwind 20 years in a matter of weeks, but it begins now. Not as a gesture, as a fact. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know. Not because it affects anything between us. Not because I'm asking you for anything. He looked out the windshield at the pre-dawn gray of the Soto Street. Because you spent 11 years in the middle of something you didn't choose, and you have a right to know when the thing is actually changing. She was quiet for longer than usual. When it's done, she said finally. When the restructuring is real and not a plan you show Malik. Not me, show him, she paused. He's the one who needs to see it. I know, he asked me last night when we were driving whether he thought you could actually change. She said it plainly, without editorializing. I told him I didn't know. That it was the kind of thing a person had to watch over time. What did he say? He said that sounded like something I'd say. A pause that had something in it he couldn't fully read. He's his mother's son, Do-hwan, but he's watching you. The legal resolution took 19 days. Stedman worked it with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years making difficult things disappear through the proper application of law and leverage in equal measure. The consortium, faced with the Yoon documentation and the exposure it created for them, negotiated from a position of significantly reduced confidence. The private intelligence organization's methods had included several collection activities of questionable legality, which gave Stedman additional surface area to work with. The file was sealed. The letter was returned the original photograph, the copies, the digital versions with signed documentation confirming no remaining copies existed. Stedman had it verified through a third party before he accepted the resolution. Yoon's disbarment proceedings began the following month. Do-hwan did not publicize it or announce it. He didn't need to. Stedman's colleagues filed the relevant complaints, and the process ran on its own momentum from there, the way these processes did when the documentation was complete. Ri's transition out of the organization took 60 days under Jin-soo's oversight. He was methodical and cooperative throughout, which Do-hwan had not been entirely certain of. Whatever Ri had been building, he was also a practical man, and the parameters Do-hwan had laid out were ones a practical man could work within. He left in April with arrangements that reflected 9 years of service, and a mutual understanding things would not be discussed by either party going forward. The restructuring took longer. Jin-soo had been right that 20 years couldn't be unwound in weeks. What Do-hwan found, working through it with Stedman and Jin-soo, and 2 legitimate business attorneys who didn't know the full picture but knew enough, a sound like Greenwood was that the legitimate infrastructure was actually more substantial than the criminal layer that had been running underneath it. The logistics empire, the ports, the shipping contracts, the import operations was genuinely viable as a clean enterprise. It had been built to serve dual purposes, but had been built well, and stripping the criminal layer from it was painful and slow, and occasionally required decisions that cost money. But it was possible. He spent 6 months making it possible. He did not tell Zuri about each step. She had not asked to be updated, and he had no right to ask for credit. He told Malik in a series of Saturday morning conversations at the same coffee shop with the mismatched chairs, because Malik had asked him to, and because Malik was, as Zuri had said, watching. Malik listened to all of it. He asked specific questions, not emotional ones, the way a younger version of him might have, but operational ones, which made Do-hwan see his son differently. Malik understood more about what he'd been told than he'd let on. He had apparently spent considerable time after Zuri's conversation with him doing his own research, his own quiet assessment of the world his father moved in. He was his mother's son. In September, 8 months after the night of the text in the Snohomish property and the Soto office, Do-hwan sat across from Malik at the coffee shop and told him that the restructuring was complete enough to be real. Not finished, some things would take years to fully resolve, but real. The sound like infrastructure was gone. The remaining operations were clean enough that Stedman could review them without concern. Malik looked at him for a long time. "Show me," Malik said. "What do you want to see?" "I don't know exactly. Just something real. Not a description. Something I can actually look at." Do-hwan pulled out his phone and showed him the documentation. Not everything. Enough. The legal restructuring filings, the dissolution of certain arrangements, the legitimate business registrations. Malik scrolled through it. He was 18 by then, a few months from the end of his senior year, and he had his mother's way of reading things, slowly, completely, without reacting, until he had finished. He handed the phone back. "Oh," he said. "Okay," Do-hwan said. "I'm not going to say it's enough," Malik said, "because I don't know yet if it is. It's going to take a while to know. I know that. But it's something real." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "That's what I wanted. Something real." They sat in the coffee shop for another hour. They talked about Malik's college applications, which were going to 2 schools in California and 1 in Washington. They talked about a history class he was in that he actually liked. They talked about the kind of ordinary things that fathers and sons talk about over coffee when the extraordinary has been set aside, at least temporarily, and there's nothing left to do but be in the same room. Ariel was harder, not difficult, the way anger is difficult. She never expressed anger at Do-hwan directly, which was in some ways more difficult to navigate than anger would have been. She was simply consistently reserved with him. She came to the arranged family dinners. Zuri had agreed to monthly dinners at a neutral restaurant where both parents were present, for the children's sake, and she sat and ate and answered questions with the particular courtesy of a 13-year-old who has decided that courtesy is the safest distance to maintain. Do-hwan did not push her. He showed up to things instead. Her school events, a debate competition in October where she stood at a podium and argued with complete conviction for a position she'd been assigned rather than chosen, which Do-hwan found both impressive and, when he thought about it, perfectly in keeping with who her mother was. He sat in the audience with the other parents, and he did not draw attention to himself, and he did not arrive late, and he did not leave early. Ariel saw him when she walked off the stage. She looked at him with her mother's eyes, which were eyes that never gave away more than they intended to. She came over. "You came," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I got second," and walked past him to where her team was gathered. It was the first thing she had volunteered to him in 8 months. He stood in the gymnasium of her school and felt it the way a man feels something he knows he doesn't deserve and isn't going to get again right away and has to learn to be patient with carefully without letting it show how much it meant. Zuri rebuilt her life with the methodical clarity of someone who had been planning it for years, which she had been. She enrolled in a graduate program in urban planning at the University of Washington, something she had been accepted to but before she married Do-hwan, and then deferred again, and eventually stopped thinking about as a possibility. She went back to it at 35, with a determination that her study partners, who were mostly 22, found slightly intimidating and deeply useful, when group projects needed someone who would actually finish things. She kept the small house. She did something about the curtains, eventually not immediately, but by late spring, she had replaced them with ones she would have chosen. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She hired a lawyer, a different one, someone with no connection to anyone in Do-hwan's professional world, and completed the divorce on her terms. It was uncontested. Do-hwan's side of the negotiation was handled by Stedman, who was thorough and fair and occasionally surprised by how clearly Zuri knew what she wanted and didn't want. She wanted the children's financial security maintained. She wanted complete personal independence, no strings from his world, attached to her income, her property, her professional life. She wanted legal language that protected her from any future exposure related to his business, covering the full period of their marriage. She did not want the mansion. She did not want what she called legacy guilt money, a phrase she used in a negotiation session that Stedman apparently repeated to Do-hwan verbatim because it was the most precise description of a particular financial offer he had ever heard. What she accepted was straightforward and fair, and nothing more. She signed the final papers in February, 14 months after the first filing. This time she did not have to kneel on a marble floor to collect scattered pages. This time the papers were on a table, and she signed them at a desk in an attorney's office with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold beside her. And she signed her name, and she left, and she drove herself home, and she stood in the kitchen of the small house and made a new cup of coffee and drank it in the quiet. The quiet was different from the mansion's quiet. The mansion's quiet had been the silence of a large space insufficiently inhabited, a space whose emptiness was a symptom. This quiet was the quiet of a life that fit the person living it. Small and particular and completely hers, she stood in it for a long time. A year and some months after the night, Do-hwan had thrown the divorce papers across the marble floor. There was a family dinner at a restaurant in Capitol Hill that Malik had chosen because he said it had good food and neutral ground, by which he meant no one had a history with it. They sat in a round booth, which Ariel had specifically requested because she didn't want anyone to be at the head of the table. Zuri one side, Do-hwan across, Malik and Ariel between them in an arrangement that made it clear the children were not buffer material but had simply decided where they wanted to sit. The dinner was not easy. Easy was not the word for what these dinners were. They were real, which was different and harder and more durable. Ariel told a story about her debate team that made Malik add details she hadn't included and made Zuri laugh at something specific and made Do-hwan sit and listen with the complete attention of a man who has learned, late, that listening is not a passive activity, but the most active thing he can do in a room where he spent years not doing it. He did not try to run the table. He did not try to direct the conversation. He ate his food, and he listened, and he was present in the way that presence actually means not physically occupying a chair, but being genuinely, attentively in the room with the people you're supposed to love. After dinner, Malik and Ariel went ahead to the car, and Zuri and Do-hwan stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside, while the November air moved through the street and the restaurant noise filtered out through the door behind them. Do-hwan looked at her. She was in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark burgundy, and she had let her hair loose, and she looked like the woman he had met when she was 23, managing an architecture firm's office and making every room more organized by walking into it. She looked like herself, not the version that had lived inside his life for 11 years. The version that existed when nobody was asking her to be anything other than what she was. Ariel seems better, he said. She's been better for a few months, Zuri said. She processes slowly, always has, like me. Zuri looked at him. She processes slowly in a healthy way. You processed slowly in the way of a man who was avoiding the thing he needed to process. He accepted that without argument because it was accurate. I missed it, he said. How she processes. I missed watching it happen. You didn't miss all of it. She said it without comfort and without cruelty. As a fact. She's 15 next year. There's still time to watch. Is there if you show up? She adjusted the collar of her coat. That's the only requirement, Do-hwan. Just show up. Not dramatically. Not with money or arrangements or gestures. Just physically consistently on time. She paused. It's not complicated, I know. You always knew. That was the part that was so. She stopped, looked at the street for a moment. You knew what they needed, and you chose other things anyway. That's what the letter was about. Not that you were absent because you didn't know. You were absent because you had built a world where absence was the cost, and you paid it and we paid it, and for a long time you thought that was an acceptable arrangement. He stood on the sidewalk and let her say it because she was right and because she had been saying versions of it for 11 years to a man who hadn't been ready to hear it, and he was finally, irrevocably, ready to hear it. I'm not angry anymore, she said. I want you to know that. Not because everything is resolved or forgiven, or whatever word you'd want to put on it. Just because the anger was exhausting, and I have other things I want to do with the energy. What are you doing with it? The graduate program. The children, the garden. She glanced at him. I fixed the irises. Cut them back in spring. They'll be manageable now. He thought about her standing at the kitchen window of the mansion on her birthday, thinking about the irises, and felt the specific texture of that specific loss, the loss of all the mornings like that one. All the ordinary things he had not been present for, all the moments that had added up to 11 years of a woman quietly disappearing inside a life that didn't fit her. The morning of your 35th birthday, he said. She looked at him. You were standing at the kitchen window. I came home, and you told me it was your birthday, and I said I would make a reservation. He looked at the street. I didn't make a reservation. No. I have thought about that specific morning more than I have thought about almost anything else in the last year, he said. Not because it was the worst thing I ever did. It wasn't. It was just ordinary. An ordinary morning where I made the ordinary choice I always made, which was to file the thing that mattered into the category of things I'd handle later. He paused. And later was always what I gave you. Zuri was quiet. The pizza was good, she said finally. He looked at her. The birthday dinner. Pizza on the couch with the kids. Her voice was even, but there was something in it that was almost not quite, but almost gentle. It was actually a good evening. I want you to know that. In middle of everything, it was a good evening. He stood on the sidewalk and understood that she was not offering him absolution. She was giving him a true thing because she was a person who gave true things, even when the true thing was complicated, even when it existed alongside everything else that was also true. The birthday had been a failure, and the evening had been good, and both of those things were real, and she was big enough to hold both without resolving them into something simpler. He had married a woman of enormous interior capacity and spent 11 years failing to inhabit the same space with her. Zuri, he said. Don't, she said quiet. Not hard. Not a wall. Just a limit. He understood. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be a version of something already said. The letter had said it. The porch had said it. The coffee shop with Malik, the Tacoma warehouse, the Soto office at 5 a.m, all of it had said it in different registers and different volumes, and the saying was finished. What was left was not words. What was left was time and actions and the slow, undramatic work of being present for two children who were watching to see whether the change was real or another version of the promise they'd heard before. Go home, she said. It's cold. He nodded. She walked toward the car where Malik and Ariel were waiting, and he watched her go the way you watch something you have reckoned with completely, not with the ache of wanting it back, but with the specific, complicated recognition of what it was and what it cost, and what it required to let it finally be what it is. She reached the car. Ariel said something, and Zuri laughed briefly, and the sound of it carried back down the sidewalk to where he was standing. He stayed for a moment in the November cold. Then he walked to his own car separate and drove home to a house that was smaller now than the mansion had been, and that fit him better for being smaller. And he sat for a while in the kitchen before going to bed, in the chair where he had always sat, in the quiet that was no longer the wrong kind of quiet, but simply the quiet of a man at the end of a day, alone with what he had done and what he had not done, and what he was slowly, genuinely trying to become. He did not read the letter again that night. He hadn't read it in months. He didn't need to anymore. He had read it enough times that it had moved out of the envelope and into him, into the place where things live when you have finally stopped arguing with them. He left it on the desk, sealed back in its envelope. Across the front, in Zuri's handwriting, the 5 words she had written the night she left. He had opened it. He had read it. He had done what it asked of him, not all at once, not cleanly, not without cost and wreckage and the long humiliation of being a man who had to learn the same lesson through every possible channel before it finally arrived. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, Seattle went on with its night, indifferent and ordinary and continuous, the way cities do, carrying everyone through the hours equally. The ones who had figured things out, and the ones still working on it, the ones who had left, and the ones they had left behind, moving through time at the same rate, regardless of what any of them had lost or salvaged, or was still, slowly and imperfectly, being made into something that might eventually be called enough.